Good morning, Yamini. It's great to talk to you, and thank you again for agreeing to join our oral history project for the ASAA's 50th anniversary.
Oh, thank you for thinking of me for your project, David. I'm so excited to talk to you.
Thank you. Well, look, just to start off, by way of context, Yamini is one of my colleagues here at Deakin, but might be people who are watching this recording who don't know you, haven't had the chance to meet you. So could you just start by briefly telling us about what you're doing, what your position is at Deakin at the moment, and how you describe your expertise?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm currently an ARC Future Fellow at Deakin University, which and that basically means that I have a fellowship for 4 years, which allows me to work specifically, in this case, on the intersection between animals and international relations. And the way that I've envisaged this project empirically, because it is very difficult to think about animals and international relations in a very abstract sense, I try to empirically draw it down to borderlands about how animals specifically shape border politics between countries. And it's actually really interesting in the ways that they really do, and they are such a unfeatured, unnoted aspect of international relations in the ways that they are used to mediate, in the ways that they're used to subvert, in the ways that they're used to weaponize. Militarized, the way that animals are used as militarized bodies as well, but also in the ways in which differing laws between countries affect their conservation status, their wildlife status. So an animal in India, a protected animal in India, 40 kilometers into Bangladesh would have a completely different status, and that actually affects their conservation status, their endangered status, etc. So there's a few different ways in which, and of course animals we also don't recognize have their own states, have their own borders, have their own sovereignties, have their own territorialities. And the idea of the Westphalian state is constantly interfering with those as well. So so that's what my project's about, and I'm looking at it in South Asia across 4 South Asian countries. So India and Pakistan, India and Bangladesh, India and Bhutan, and India and Nepal.
Great. I would love to know more about this, and I want to stick to our script. But just as a follow up, there is in doing that in doing your project, are you focusing on, is it the borders that are front and center, or is it the animals? Is it particular animals that you're seeing contested, or is it more of the focus on the borders, or a bit of both?
That's such a great question. No, it's actually animals in borders, so it's both. It is very much both. And the reason you look at the reason borders are interesting is because there's that idea of transgressing borders. There's that idea of trespassing borders, and there's an idea of who is welcome and who is not. There's an idea of hostility and welcomingness, right? And that applies equally to animal bodies as well. So, but though there are really interesting ways in which animals shape how borders are either closed off or opened as well. There's a porosity or an opaqueness to borders, and that actually very much pivots around animal bodies, which I kind of conceptually understood, but not as closely as I am beginning to now. So the focus is on both, basically, animals and borders.
Okay, thank you. And could you also just, before I get to the next question, in terms of your training, with your education, could you just tell us briefly sort of which disciplines you took your training in over the years?
Yeah, so I did my PhD in development studies, and my focus was all on feminist urban planning in India. So trying to think about gender sensitive cities, trying to think about gender-sensitive urban planning, and anyone familiar with Indian cities knows that there's a lot of problems with issues of social access, equity, things like that, and specifically how that applies to women was my focus when I first started my PhD. And in the last about 15 years, I would say that I have really remade myself as a geographer. And that disciplinary transition was quite difficult initially because I didn't quite understand the tenets of geography. I was never trained in it. So I had to self-train myself to become a geographer. And if I'd known better, I would have probably done my PhD in geography. So in that sense, my academic identity feels a little bit split because I teach in development studies, but I research in geography. So geographies of South Asia, geographies of animal geographies, environmental geographies, these are my core research focus now.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I suppose that's a helpful little segue to the next question about, I suppose, to what degree does the term Asianist or sort of Asian studies matter to you? Do you is it something? I mean, from what you said about your upcoming project for the fellowship, but also with say PhD, it's been situated in South Asia in different aspects. But I mean, how does that sort of intersect or sort of overlap with your disciplinary training, shall we say?
Yeah, Asian studies has been incredibly important in my disciplinary training. Interestingly, geographies, with the intersection between, I mean, area studies per se should be actually relevant across all disciplines, and sometimes that sort of bridge seems strangely difficult to make. But as you can imagine, the conversation between geography and area studies generally is fairly smooth. We see I think geography recognizes the importance of area studies very much. So, and especially one that is as multidisciplinary as Asian studies per se. So in terms of engaging South Asian studies, and Asian studies broadly, but definitely in terms of engaging, and I do engage Asian studies much more broadly through the interdisciplinary lens of geography per se, because geography itself is so multidisciplinary. So when you're talking about urban development and looking at urban context, inevitably, there's going to be, interesting literature on animals and urban geographies, for example, from Taiwan or from, Hong Kong or whatever. So I'm very aware of the larger Asian landscape constantly because of the geographical focus. But Asian studies speaks very clearly to geography, and what's really interesting for me and what the value that I get from South Asian studies, very broadly conceived, is the detail to the minute structures of society, right? Like that kind of insight, that very micro level, that sort of very microscopic level, that insight into probing societal level nuances. And that kind of detail lends so beautifully to the kind of work that I'm trying to do in terms of spatiality or scale, because when you're talking about scale at a very broad level, and then you have an understanding, and you realize the importance of understanding at microcosmic levels, I think that's what the sort of social aspect of Asian studies really delivers to me, and I really value that very highly. So that's been one of the most important things that I have drawn, for example, in the context of India studies of caste, which is so broad and so detailed at the same time. So incredibly detailed. So when you're and interestingly, there isn't actually a developed geographies of caste per se. There is geographies of race, but there isn't actually a properly conceived or comparable geographies of caste in the same way. So I think, but this discipline is emerging, this sort of lens is emerging rapidly, and I think, for example, all that anthropological, but also South Asian work, which I think there's a lot of intersection with anyway, this will be critical in enlarging these types of other fields, which are emergent in other fields. So I think South Asian studies has a huge potential, Asian studies per se, in enlarging niche disciplines that are constantly emerging in a whole spectrum of other disciplines.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I'm sort of intrigued that you're now sort of adopting the similar logic with your new project, I suppose, moving into international relations too. And I mean, personally, as someone who works in that field, that makes a lot of sense to me. And especially the sort of the overlap or what I would think is a similar logic to geography, like critical geography, and I think and IR should complement each other quite beautifully.
Absolutely, absolutely, and what for example, borders are highly multicultural, multicaste, multilingual spaces, right? And this and that kind of detail, and there's a lot of really great work on South Asian border studies that's emergent. But South Asian animal studies also is very, very rapidly emergent. I think if you look at animal studies as a discipline, a significant proportion of animal studies is actually South Asian animal studies. And there's a lot of South Asianists working on animal studies from India principally, but also Pakistan, emergent elsewhere, and we kind of applying the same sociological, area-based analysis to how animal bodies are impacting social structures. Not just human social structures, but animal social structures. But it's not in that zoological sense, but it's actually really in a very socio-political sense. Yeah.
It's, we'll be looking forward to hearing more about your work. Now, I suppose I was going to ask you, I suppose, how Asia or Asian studies features in your current work, and I suppose you've probably answered that in the sense of the fellowship already, so you talked a bit about that. Just to take it back a step, in the context of your time at Deakin, and most of it has been, I suppose, in teaching and in the International Community Development Program.
Yeah.
Have you managed to just sort of surface much of Asia or Asian studies in your work there, in your teaching?
Interestingly, no. So our disciplinary focus in the development studies program has very much been about service delivery. It's about skilling people towards, delivering roles as practitioners. So to that extent, an area of focus has been acutely missing, actually. It's one of the most, it's the big gap. It's what, the lack of it is truly impoverishing. I think the lack of an area studies focus, the lack of an Asian studies focus specifically in this case, really does impoverish disciplines. So when it's missing, when it is there, you take it for granted, and when it is missing, you really realize that it's impoverishing the discipline. So the last time I actually taught a South Asia focused subject was at La Trobe, which was where I used to work more than 15 years ago. It's been that long. So I'm not sure elsewhere in other disciplines at Deakin how it is. But for example, India, which is such a huge focus, is really missing in terms of both expertise, staff expertise, in terms of subjects that are oriented towards India. It's a huge gap, and I think one that will actually enrich teaching and research so much, but that really needs targeted understanding and investment.
Yes, yeah, and no, well, I think there's probably a similar pattern across the other disciplines too. That shift away from sort of regional speciality, as you say, but it's a loss. And,
it's a real loss. And it's such an impoverished situation.
And whether it be East Asia or South Asia, I mean, they're worlds unto themselves. You could, there's best part of 2 billion people, isn't there, living in South Asia alone? So you could certainly say something, and there'd be a lot of potential for theory generation, arguably, sort of in such a large geographic and population space. So,
exactly.
Okay, so again, maybe you've sort of answered this, but I'll pitch the question to you anyway. I mean, if you had to sort of explain your origin story in Asian studies, such as it is, I mean, even given I know that you've explained a bit about your background.
Yeah.
Sort of when, where, how did it begin?
I think it was in significant part driven by just where I come from, but it's actually deeper than that. So when I was in India, I was doing my postgraduate studies in journalism, in print journalism, and one of the things that we were taught, one of the core subjects that we were taught, was to report on issues of poverty, because obviously poverty is it's a big theme in India. It's a big aspect of what media reports on, and what responsible, accurate, detailed observation and reporting and writing of poverty should look like. So we were actually trained a lot in reporting both urban poverty and rural poverty, and that really impacted me immensely. First of all, not in driving the focus on India, just because I achieved a that was my first taste of fieldwork in India, so to speak, and so I never strayed away from that. And then of course it also led to my doing a PhD in development studies at that time. And I've tried a few times, I have to say, to at least get away from India in terms of my research focus. So to my credit, I tried even 10 years ago when I was thinking about my DECRA project. I was thinking, I should try and do it somewhere else, at least in South Asia. I never managed to get away from India because, I mean, it's such a huge and complex country. I mean, it just, barely stating the surface of any study that you do on India, or anywhere for that matter. But India is so incredibly diverse, so incredibly contradictory. I mean, it's all of those sort of cliches that you hear about India, but they are true, which makes moving out of India a very difficult decision as an academic choice, because there's just so much left untended and ununderstood in my own understanding. So that made it very difficult to actually get away from India. And when I thought about the future fellowship, I just thought, oh, well, I really should do it somehow. And I actually thought, I can't though lose my focus on India, because again, I think that's going to be my story for the rest of my life, in the sense that it's going to be impossible to leave India just because there is just so much that is left untended. And especially when you are using animals now as an entry point, and that sort of understanding itself is only newly developing. then there is so much again, regionally, species-wise, people's relationship, the relationship between caste and species. As you think about the relationship between race and species, when animals are used to dehumanize, but that has an impact on animals too. Like animals are also in a way de-animalized, right? And there's social violence, heavy social violence associated with that. So and so when I was thinking about, I stepped out as far as I did when I was, looking at Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India, and that, and my choice in looking at borders was also driven by that. I just thought, visually at least, I have literally one foot in India and one foot in the other country, so I never lose my foothold in India, so to speak, right? So that was my way of somehow ensuring that I still had a foot in India, quite literally, on one side of the border at least. So that has been my drive. In a way, I feel sort of captured by India, but at the same time, it's also been a choice. In just not being able to get away. So there was a time when I wrote Mother Cow, Mother India, which could have been, I'm happy that it wasn't, it didn't. We were all, even the press was expecting a lot of controversy around the book, and negative controversy around the book, which didn't happen because the cow is such a controversial subject in India, and surprisingly it didn't happen. That doesn't mean it won't, because oftentimes these days there's delayed responses.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a time when I was thinking, oh well, if I can't go to India anymore, where will I research? I was thinking, oh, maybe Africa, or maybe South America, or maybe somewhere else in Australia. But none of them rang true, just because that sense of unfinished work in India is so strong. And this is not a nationalistic feeling really as much as an academic one.
Yeah.
There's just so much that I don't understand, and I've come this far, as far as I have, and yet there's just so much left untended. So I feel almost this responsibility now that I need to take it as far as I can in my lifetime.
Yeah. Can I just ask as well? So in doing that work, like even with your Mother Cow book, were you? Did you have some? Were there any particular sort of India-based collaborators who you really gelled with, and that you could you tell us a little bit about any local collaborations you had there? Or?
Yeah. So all of my collaborators are activists or people working empirically in the field, even in objectionable ways. So, for example, cow vigilantes who will, whose motivation with animal protection is, very racist, very violent. But what I'm saying is, my collaborators are everyone who fall outside of academia. So I tend not to generally engage or collaborate with academics, and that's because I think academics have a way of, which is one of our skills. But what we do is constantly theorize what we see, and I didn't want that sort of interference onto what I was watching. I wanted to understand people's perspectives rather than an academic perspective, which is already theorized and to some extent polished and to some extent thought through, and there's a rationale attached to the worldviews that I'm being presented with. I didn't want that. I actually didn't want that sort of polished overlay. So I tended to, in fact, I've been asked a few times why I don't collaborate with academics in India, and I think it's not that I don't collaborate with academics in India or anywhere else. I generally tend not to collaborate with academics when it comes to fieldwork. So I keep them out of it, just because there's a very polished overlay to the world, to how the world is perceived, and that is our job.
No, I like your point there, and just there's two things I would just say. I suppose the first is that the to use that word, polish or lack of it, that's underplaying it. But I mean, it's making it comprehensible to people who, to people from your perspective, who matter the most, whether it be the activists, right? So it's got to be, it's a question of communication.
Yes.
There, I think it sounds like you're well aware of that and doing a good job of it. But the other part, I suppose, is to say, well, if no one else is sort of doing that academic work in India, or not many people are, then it's very valuable for you to do it from outside of India or something, with one foot in, one foot out, right? So it's a useful place to be, in a sense.
It is a useful way to be, and I appreciate very much having access to a very different way of thinking. Our thinking as academics is carry so much effort into rationalizing, into justifying. And I'm not saying that people outside of academia do not. I mean, I think intuitively you want to rationalize and justify whatever you say, but we are trained to do it in particular ways, and we are expected, we are critiqued for it, we critique each other for it. And that's, I mean, as I said, that's very much part of our skills. That is something to be proud of. I'm not decrying it, but that concerted effort that goes constantly into using your brain in a particular way, I think it actually also carries a cost. And when I can free myself of that and just receive thoughts that and ideas and worldviews that I can then later take on and, you know, do what I want to with them later on, or do what I will with, you know, with all the accountability and the responsibility, but just to sort of engage in the world as a human being, as a citizen, as someone, as just an embodied being in the world without carrying an academic accountability all the time is actually very freeing.
Yes. Yeah. It's certainly a different conversation you can have with people who are not academics, right? But it's not lacking in rigor or
No.
interesting like that. It's we certainly. But it is a different way of speaking and communicating. Yeah.
It is, and what I love about it is that sometimes someone will say something with so much insight,
Yes.
but that is not an outcome of the kind of, you know, concerted, efforted thinking that we put into it. Like it's a more native, indigenous wisdom, and I don't mean that in a sense, in a racial sense. I mean that in indigenous in terms of just arising out of a very spontaneous and authentic engagement with the world, rather than over examining it too much. I think I like that spontaneity, the wisdom that comes out of a spontaneous engagement with the world, rather than one that is too overworked. You know, on the one hand, and it's not to say that these are not unexamined lives. I think they are very examined lives when, you know, but there's a spontaneity which I think kind of becomes missing in our work and in our thinking.
And propensity for action too. Sort of getting things done. I think is sort of really focus on
and the capacity to be reactive.
Yeah,
I think right, which is not something that we are necessarily allowed.
Yes. Okay, so Yamini, in your work so far, your years as a practicing academic, shall we say, could you tell us about one piece of work, or one plus piece of work that whether it be a book, an article, could be that book, or any other publication that you think best reflects your work? What are you most proud of, I suppose, is another way of putting it. I mean, there are two different questions, sorry.
I mean, I'm tempted to say Mother Cow, Mother India was probably my most honest work to date. I don't ever recall caring as much about any work or any field of research as much as I did for Mother Cow, Mother India. Mother Cow, Mother India is my first major animal studies publication. I mean, I've had journal articles, but in terms of my first big book, that was Mother Cow, Mother India. But I think this speaks more broadly to my decision to transition into animal studies itself. It was an overnight decision. I literally made the decision overnight to walk away from my previous areas of research without knowing anything about animal studies. I didn't know people. I didn't have a reference list. I didn't know who the sort of great names of the field were. But this was like honestly, this was like falling in love for the first time and understanding that this is what love feels like, right? I had no idea that this is what academic love could feel like. This is what scholarly love could feel like. Like, this was just, I cared about my research. I've always been conscientious. I've always been hardworking in that sense. So I cared about what I did previously. I've done my best. But I did not know what it was like to fall in love. Like, I just thought, oh, well, that was love. That was not love. That was not even close. So this, I think it was that sort of, it was almost like a genetic remaking of myself, to be honest. And I think that became, you know, that so basically Mother Cow, Mother India carried that level of commitment and all-consuming. It was an all-consuming commitment, so which also meant there's a cost to that in terms of exhaustion and burnout, and you know, it carries its own trauma, especially when you're looking at issues of violence and very normalized violence. The violence against animals is very, very, very normalized, and it's invisibilized, and it's not seen as such a lot of the times.
Yes.
So to be discerning in that level and to really land your gaze on an individual animal body, on an individual calf, and the cow that is trying to get to the calf, all of that was extraordinarily difficult, and that sort of sustained work over the last decade was hard. But I think Mother Cow, Mother India carried that level of commitment, that level of care, and love.
That's and it would seem from my vantage point, it seems that it's, of course, as you say, there were other publications covering it, but the book was the mere culmination. As you say, it was such a long build up there. Sort of the decision to, the easiest bit of the way was the decision to say, I'm going to move to a new field, but then to do that work and to be so involved in it, and because of the nature of the work, and sort of seeing firsthand the cruelty sort of animals are subjected to. There was so much emotional work that's gone in there.
And this was also a time when I was basically teaching myself two disciplines at the same time, which one was geography, the principles of geography, because I entered the field through animal geography. So the reason I got into geography in the first place was amongst the first animal colleagues that I met in the field. The animal studies scholars that I met in the field were geographers. So, I mean, if they had been sociologists, I might have actually turned to sociology. Like, it was just a matter of chance that some of the most compelling scholars that I met in the early stages of my sort of foray into animal studies were geographers. So I was teaching myself geography as well as animal studies at the same time. So there was also that sort of intellectual load that this journey involved, that the writing of the book involved. So I started, in a way, writing the book too early. I started writing the book 2 years before I started to rewrite it again. And I had to step back and start writing a few journal articles just to sort of try and understand exactly what was I trying to say about a very complicated story. It's a very complicated story of nationalism, because the cow body basically stands for the aspirational Hindu state, right? Like, India is a secular state, but Hindu extremism and Hindu nationalism has always wanted to remake India into a Hindu state. They've tried they have lots of different approaches, but one of them has been to sort of mobilize the body of the cow as a Hindu body. So the cow is basically a Hindu animal, so that's why it was Mother Cow, Mother India, because so there was a story of nationalism to be told. There was a story of dairy production to be told, because dairying is very much interwoven with the story of the newly born post-colonial state. In terms of lifting India into poverty, one of the big interventions of the Indian state was to invest in dairy production. Dairy is India's largest rural employer. Then there is that divisiveness about how the cow body is quite literally rendered a body of warscape between Hindus and Muslims, because most of the butchers are Muslims, and that's not because that's what they aspire to do. But if you look at the most impoverished, if you look at the butchering class just about in any country, they tend to be undocumented workers, they tend to be racialized workers, they tend to be the poorest workers. So too in India, they tend to be the Muslims, because they are amongst the poorest in the country. So Muslims and Dalit workers tend to be, butchers.
Yeah.
So there's that overlay, and then of course there's that central story of the animal herself that's never been told.
Yeah. So just on the substance, so just on the follow-up question, you mentioned the socio-religious makeup of the butchers. Would the same apply to, say, the tannery workers and things like that, and all that side? What happens afterwards, I suppose, after the slaughter has been complete? I mean, do they tend to be people from the lower caste or from of Muslim?
Absolutely. So the tanners also do tend to be. It's very interesting. The tanners tend to be of Muslims or Dalit workers. The dairy farmers, on the other hand, typically tend to be of slightly higher castes, right? So the interesting thing is, as you would know, cow slaughter is prohibited in most of India, right? And India is the largest producer of beef. India is the largest dairy producing country. What is interesting is India is the largest dairy producing country since 1997, unbroken record of being the leading dairy producer. And very few people understand or appreciate that dairy is also a slaughter industry, except that you just move you need. So Carol Adams talks about feminized protein, eggs and milk. You actually need the animal to be alive and constantly reproductive it's not enough for the animal to be productive. Animal has to be reproductive.
Yes,
right? And then eventually, when their reproductive capacities drop, off they go to the slaughterhouse.
Yes.
In India, we pretend that is not the case. So what we actually have is, it is purely in terms of management and purely in terms of a business model, so to speak, it's spectacular. We have the largest underground cow slaughtering industry in the world. We're not talking about 1 or 2 backyard butchers. We have a countrywide network. Of course, because we just can't do it legally. We do it illegally.
Yes.
And who does it illegally? It's the Muslims and the butchers. It's the Muslims and the Dalits. So that becomes a way of criminalizing them and persecuting them in so many different ways. So there's this divisive story of nationalism to be told.
Yes. You're making me think about what happens in Australia too, because it's all the Pacific Island workers and the Koreans, I think, who work in the abattoirs, in whether it be in Goulburn or in Warrnambool, places like that. That's what you hear about, and doing that very dirty work, I think.
And difficult work,
So, okay, if we could change tack a little bit. Or actually, before we get to that, I suppose just one sort of quicker question. Evidently, just my perspective, it seems that a lot of the logic of your mother cow book could inform your new study. Is that right? How does one relate to the other? Or are you going to move a little bit away from cows for your fellowship, or is?
I am. Well, yeah. I think I will be moving a little bit away from cows. So this was about the story of animals, and ultimately it became a political science study in many ways. It was a story of animals and nationalism, about how animals inform state politics.
Yeah.
And they really do. There's a huge, there's so many books. For example, I recently reviewed this book, which is about how wolves remake Canada.
Okay. Yeah.
About the changing status of wolves as villain, vermin, icon, and now kin, because of the sort of re-engage, and they've gone from being villain under colonial times to kin through an indigenous, because of foregrounding indigeneity and indigenous ways of relating to nature as kin. So they've actually, this entire story of viewing the wolves in these 4 different ways is also a story of Canada itself, about how Canada itself is sort of represented in different ways. Or
well, I suppose to add to that, there's also the idea that dogs descend from the wolves too, right? So they're very much kin.
Exactly.
In Canada and elsewhere.
And the mother cow is the ultimate kin, right? Quite literally the mother.
Yeah.
So I think now it's just moved from animals and nationalism to animals and sort of international geopolitics and
within India to India and its neighbours, essentially.
Within India and its neighbours, but the species have changed. So currently, I'm working on, at least in the eastern borders, I'm working on elephants. So, because elephants are migratory species, heavily migratory species, and that's what is interesting because they cross borders. They cross borders in a way that is ethnographically accessible. Unlike, there's many species that also cross borders constantly, but then they're more difficult to do fieldwork on, as a social scientist at least. So these are more ethnographically accessible, and it's really interesting about the electric fences that states will put to prevent elephants from crossing over. And the implications on the other side. The huge amount of. I'll personally send you a text just to demonstrate what happens. How elephants are basically impeded in terms of movement and what that does to elephanthood.
Sure.
It's full on to even. Yeah.
I look forward to hearing more about this in years to come. But in the meantime, I will proceed with because it's a great discussion. Thank you. Could you tell us a little bit about your involvement in the ASAA or in Asian studies in Australia, whether it be as a conference goer or as a office holder or any involvements, prize winner? Tell us about also the South Asian Association. I don't know if you had any part to do with it, SASSA.
Yep. So I'm a member of both, and I've been. I think there was times when I wasn't, around COVID and difficult times like that. But otherwise, I've tried to maintain my membership with both. I think I attended my first Asian Studies conference in Perth in UWA back in 2014, and so I've been a more or less consistent attendee of the conference. I think COVID did disrupt attendance very severely, and the years after for a few years, but I'm very excited about our upcoming Deacon conference. Really excited about the upcoming Deacon conference. I have also, I was briefly one of the South Asia editor
You were,
for South Asian Studies Review under your stewardship, and I was very honored to receive the mid-career book prize from ASAA that last year, 2024. So I think Asian Studies as a discipline has been incredibly supportive of my work. I also won the President's Prize, book prize from the South Asian Studies Association for Mother Cow as well. So Asian Studies has been incredibly receptive and incredibly supportive of the work. And it also makes me think, it's not that it signals supportiveness of my work per se so much as it does of the new emergence, recognizing the importance of animal studies as a core sort of intervention in Asian studies now. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the greatest sort of significant proportion of animal studies per se comes from South Asia and comes from Asian studies per se more generally as well. There's a huge amount of work now from Chinese scholars, from Japanese scholars, from Korean scholars looking into animals and animal studies from a very sociopolitical perspective.
Yeah.
So I just want to distinguish animal studies from zoological studies, for example, which is very much pure sciencey. Or ecological studies, or So these are deploying social sciences methods, social sciences analysis in thinking about animals, and I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah. So if I could put another question to you, sort of, I know you had the stint with as the regional editor, but you've also been involved in the two associations. Do you have a bit of a feel or a sense for changing subfields within, say, South Asian studies? So when substantively, when we talk about South Asian studies, judging by what we see at conferences, by what we see come to journals, what sort of changes have you noticed, say, over the last decade or so, or however long 15 years? How long have you been in Australia?
In animal studies per se, I would say close to 12 years.
12 years.
Time flies when you're having a good time. So I would say, just from of course being located in the very specific and a very niche area that I'm in, Asian studies and South Asian studies have shown an incredible receptiveness to animal studies.
Mm-hmm.
It's been generous, it's been welcoming, it's been critically engaged, and there's been some fantastic work supported. And when I say supported, presses accepting our articles for presses are accepting articles, book presses reviewing, and taking on major book projects which are devoted to animals. The prize was an endorsement as well of the willingness to engage, to take a new field seriously, because even 12 years ago, David, when I started the studies, and they were like, oh, but why animals? Like people were pervasively, that was a big question, like, why animals? Why animals? First of all, why animals when the human situation is so bad? Why animals then? That was such a, those kind of naive questions no longer get asked, because the discipline, I think, has established itself quite well. And but that has also been because of the generosity of other disciplines in receiving this engagement. And Asian studies has definitely been generous on that count. So I would say that in terms of engagement with sub-disciplines, I think it really could be very proud of the fact that this is an emergent, new, potentially raising a few, more than any other sub-discipline. I think animal studies possibly raised a bit more skepticism in the initial years of its emergence than any other discipline, like why animals, how does it make sense in sociological worlds or in social worlds. But that engagement is something to be proud of, because I think it's, with all of its complexity, that engagement has been real. I'm also tempted to say that its engagement with queer studies has been great, because I see some fantastic books on, really important books on and I've been engaging that field a little bit, because I think there's interlinks between animal studies and queer studies. So because the animal body is a queer body as well. So I've been engaging, the queer studies literature for a while, and I've been really pleased to see a lot of amazing work from Asian scholars in this area. So I think that's been actually really interesting. Another potential promising field could be disability studies. It probably already exists, to be honest. But I think that's another major. That's such an exciting field as well. Such an exciting field. Like I think after animal studies, the field that has really intellectually challenged me has been disability studies. So I think there's great potential, and Asian studies has already demonstrated an innate openness to sort of wild engagements. Quite literally in the case of animal studies.
Yes. Well, I think you've nominated a couple of really, as you say, the areas with a bit of energy about them and excitement that and topics that attract a suitably diverse group of scholars, to them.
Yeah.
So we're really getting a range of perspectives on them. I think they're great. What would you say? I mean, obviously, again, sort of asked this question with fully the knowledge that you don't work in Asian studies per se. I mean, it's not part of your job description as such. But I mean, we're not in an Asian studies department, But how do you think Asian studies in Australia is faring at the moment? If you had to sort of think of it as a field within Australian academia, what's your sense of how it's faring at the moment, or has been in recent years?
I think Asian studies has been really underutilized in Australia. The potential is so huge, not just because of our geographic location and geopolitical location. I mean, that makes it obvious, but I actually think the intellectual potential for Asian studies to really enrich virtually every discipline we can think of in the social sciences and beyond is so immense, and it is such a gift to the intellectual advancement of literally every other discipline, and in turn to be enriched oneself, the discipline and that level of engagement I think has been severely underexploited in Australia. I feel like it is less so in the US, because it does, from my brief sort of, I've had, brief stays in the US where the sustained engagement and investment into celebrating Asian scholars and Asian studies per se has been seemed focused, seemed important, seemed like a priority. And I just think that Asian studies as a discipline, or area studies as a discipline per se, tends to get subsumed under the more traditional disciplines like sociology or political science or whatever, and it doesn't really have its own sort of institutional presence, which is, I think, easily achieved through very targeted, strategic ways of establishing it. And what that looks like could be interesting, could be a very fulfilling endeavor, actually. But I think it's very, very severely underexploited in terms of what it can offer. And I think that's also because I think some of the onus is on Asian studies there. And that was certainly an ongoing challenge, and an interesting challenge that I had as an editor, as the editor, one of the editors of Asian Studies Review, was how do you position your self-identity and your contributions and your distinctiveness, which is very difficult for area studies, actually. So geography, for example, is very theoretically oriented, and there's clarity that you want to understand theoretical contributions to ideas of space, scale, and time. Like these notions are important for geography, right? And I'm not saying that it needs to be that specific. Like anthropology as well, from what I understand, has a certain distinctiveness, has a certain sort of clarity about who it is. I think potentially Asian studies could self-define itself without that self-definition being a limitation in any way, but as a way of positioning, as a way of engagement, because I just think engagement becomes easier when identities are clear. When you know who you are, and when I know who I am, we can actually relate to each other better. So I think some of that onus is on Asian studies in terms of clarifying itself, its methodological distinctions, while they may well come from other fields, but just to sort of own it a little bit more. It's the same with a lot of new fields. Animal studies has the same problem. Who is animal studies? What is animal studies? It's not about your political orientation alone, but what is your intellectual orientation? Like what defines you intellectually?
what's your big idea sort of thing, or one of, yeah.
And what's your big mode, your method? What's your what's your preoccupation in terms of your intellectual and political? What's your stakes? What's your intellectual stakes and what's your political stakes? You know, and I think that tends to be everything, which is the good thing, but I think we still need some type of a directive, some type of a parameter, and I think that would might actually go some way as well in consolidating its presence more, which is full of potential.
It is. Well, look, in a way, you've sort of preempted the final question I was going to ask, which is sort of what Asian studies as a field, or what Asianists need to do to sort of, I don't know, to safeguard their future. But I think you've sort of gone some way to answering that already, which is to tell a better story about itself. But is there anything else you would like to add there? Sort of, whether it be maybe, I mean, part of it is, I suppose, about, you know, part of what you've suggested is establishing, if I'm reading your comments correctly, is to establish a stronger institutional base within the universities. Well, that's going to require money. It's going to be funding. It's going to require sort of talking to
lobbying,
to talking to our leaders within universities too. So, but are there any other things or any other sort of people who we need to convince, I suppose, to sort of ensure, or to better ensure that bright future?
I think one of the ways in which Asian studies could self-define itself is to clarify its relationship with geography. I think area studies per se should do that. Like, what's your relationship with geography, and what defines that relationship? I think is an important starting point into establishing a more institutional presence. And institutional presence doesn't have to be a bad thing. It can, because institutions are not inherently bad. It's about the type of institution that we grow and nourish, right? So I think it needs to sort of establish some type of clarity in terms of its relationship with geography, and I think that is a mutually beneficial clarification for both disciplines. And I think that same conversation could be had with anthropology as well, just because social scientists tend to use anthropological methods, no matter what area we come from. And to that extent, for example, geography likes to think about geographical ethnographers, which I don't think anthropologists like that. They don't like, people sort of hijacking their discipline in this way, but geography tends to talk about geographical ethnographers and what that means, and I don't know if that notion has necessarily taken off very much, but what is the mode of engagement, which is anthropology. So I think if Asian studies clarifies its relationship with geography and anthropology as a start, that would actually then highlight its own distinctiveness from these two disciplines, while establishing its relationship with them. So I think that would be an important conversation.
Yeah, no. Look, I like the point you're making. The only thing I'd add to it is that I suspect the people in, say, politics or international relations or sociology would probably sort of say the same thing. Like, they would also like to kind of
clarify that relationship.
They would also like to clarify the relationship.
I think it's across the board.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And I guess the challenge is.
And in fact, even with environmental studies or ecological studies.
That's right. Yeah. But the question is that who sort of drives that process of the definition? It's probably got to come from within the area studies, doesn't it, really? I mean, rather than let it be defined from outside.
100%. It has to come from within area studies. And I think, absolutely, I take your point that every single discipline in the social sciences would do well, and Asian studies would do well to engage with every single discipline. But I think geography has a particular, benefit there just because of the area, because geography is centrally concerned with area. Like, it's, area as a concept is core to geography. And it's core to Asian studies. Like, that keyword is such a shared keyword, such an important keyword between the two disciplines, more than almost any of the other ones. Yeah. So
that's a great point. Yamini, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts today. I really enjoyed having the chance to chat to you. You've answered a lot of questions. You've raised a lot of new ones in my mind, and at some other point, it'd be great to hear more about them, both just as your colleague, but also as maybe for the under the auspices of ASAA. So thank you very much again for taking part in
Oh,
our project.
thank you, David. I really look forward to this conversation unfolding too. Thanks.
Thank you.